I'm the Publick Universal Friend. Welcome to Jackass.
Hey, I'm Bucky Q. Welcome to Jackass. Today we've convinced thousands of people that our friend Puff is gonna walk on water. Can she do it? No.
Oh, is she gonna? Oh, no! Oh, that's gotta hurt! Please, someone, listen to me, please.
What troubles you, stranger?
My daughter, she's dying. Can someone please, can the Publick Universal Friend please save our daughter?
Hey, I'm the Publick Universal Friend. Welcome back to Jackass. Today we've convinced a family with a dead child that we can bring their daughter back from the dead. Can I do it? No.
Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
And I'm Gage Hurley.
And you have arrived in the cult of Creep Street. That's right, folks. Welcome. You've been hazed, and now you've been accepted into the cult of Creep Street, where everybody has a good time. We are going to take it back now to colonial USA. That's right. We are talking about arguably one of the first cults, if not the first cult in American history. Today's episode is the cult of the Publick Universal Friend. That's right. Let me indoctrinate you with my source today. Passing Strange, True Tales of New England Hauntings and Horrors by Joseph Citro, a source we've used a few times in past episodes. But let's go ahead and dip our toes into the calm, cool waters of 1776 colonial America.
Ooh.
A time when muskets thundered in the distance and revolution rippled across the colonies. In the little town of Ledyard, Connecticut, it was making its own headlines, and it had nothing to do with liberation from the British Crown. The townsfolk were flooding into Ledyard to witness something far more unsettling. Something that didn't belong to the world of politics, but to the supernatural. A young woman, declared dead, had somehow impossibly come back to life. And word traveled fast about this miracle, even for this time when, you couldn't just text a friend, you up, to tell them about this miracle. But yet word traveled fast. And by the time the curious arrived in town, most already knew the tale. Or at least they thought they did. Because when a miracle shows up in your own backyard, the question isn't only just what happened, it's also why now, and what's still lingering in its wake. The woman at the center of this fever dream, the so-called miracle in Ledyard, was a gal named Jemima Wilkinson. She was just 24 years old at the start of our tale. She was born in 1752 in Cumberland, Rhode Island. Jemima had been raised among the Quakers and was one member of a large and devout Quaker family. But even as a child, folks had a hunch that Jemima was different. She stood out from the pack.
She was not about those oats. She was all about the pancakes.
That's right, baby. Forget those oats. She wanted cakes, and apparently, according to the tale, she had those cakes, baby. She had them. She was said to be strikingly beautiful by most accounts, but it wasn't her beauty that drew the attention. There was something else, something off-kilter. She was also known to often be unwell, prone to spells of sickness. She avoided housework like the plague and likewise seemed repelled by anything common or domestic. And she had an almost obsessive aversion to dirt, as if grime itself offended her. But where Jemima truly set herself apart was in the matters of faith. While other children played, Jemima pored over scripture. She studied Quaker doctrine, meditated on death, heaven, and the afterlife with the intensity of someone who was near the end of their life, not the vibrant age of 24. By the time she reached young adulthood, Jemima Wilkinson could quote chapter and verse as fluently as a seasoned preacher. Her everyday speech became so saturated with biblical language, so steeped in the King James cadence, that people often couldn't tell where the book ended and Jemima began. She didn't speak so much as she delivered proclamations. And while it struck some as unnerving, this young woman walking and talking like a prophet, it would, in the years to come, become one of her greatest tools. Because when the veil between life and death thinned, Jemima would have no problem stepping through it. Now, in her teenage years, tragedy struck. Jemima's mother died giving birth to her 13th child. Give it up to them Quakers and give it up to the 18th century. A staggering blow to the family that left a permanent mark. Shortly after, the grieving Wilkinsons packed up their things and left Cumberland, Rhode Island, settling then in Ledyard, Connecticut. And it was in Ledyard that Jemima really began to turn heads. On one hand, she was the stuff of rumors due to her odd mannerisms and her aloofness and holier-than-thou speech. To some, she was strange, and to others, unsettling. But to the local young guys, Jemima Wilkinson was spellbinding. With her dark hair and commanding gaze and an aura of something just slightly otherworldly, she stood apart from the other gals. She wasn't like other girls. You know, she liked football, cussing, playing video games. She literally drove the boys crazy. Jemima, she wasn't interested in chasing boys. No matter how persistent or how eligible or how flattering her suitors were, none of them stirred her soul. She had eyes for something else entirely, and soon it would come calling. Now, by all accounts, Jemima Wilkinson's path had already been set. Most who knew her thought she'd probably just grow old there in Ledyard, sickly, unmarried, forever reciting scripture into the void. That is, until Providence intervened. Because at the age of 24, Jemima fell gravely ill. And then she died. Her family, hearts heavy with sorrow, followed the custom of the day. They laid her body out in the parlor, dressed and ready for mourning. Neighbors gathered, offering prayers, kind memories, and the sort of respectful distance reserved for a good Quaker death. She was placed in a simple pine box and carried to the graveyard. But just as they were preparing to lower her into the ground, something happened. Someone stepped forward, asking to see her just one last time. History is not sure if it was family or a friend that asked this, nor is it understood why the person wanted that one last look at the body of the fair Jemima. Perhaps it was love or even suspicion. Perhaps it was something else entirely, because when the coffin lid was lifted, what they saw would send a shock through the gathered crowd. Because Jemima Wilkinson, she wasn't at her end. It was just the end of Act 1, baby.
Just the setup.
That's right. It was just the setup. She was about to go full Andy Kaufman. Kaufman on their asses. Because instead of a cold, lifeless face, they saw color in them cheeks. Her eyes wide open. And then, the miracle. Jemima Wilkinson sat up. She wasn't gasping, nor was she disoriented. She simply rose up and stepped out of the coffin like it was no more than climbing out of bed. Kind of like the Undertaker after a close 3 count. Just shoots up, you think he's down. Bam! And thus, she began to speak. Not in terror or confusion, but with prophecy. She spoke clearly, calmly, and with the cadence of scripture. At the moment of death, she said she had been visited by 2 archangels descending from the east. She's described them as wearing golden crowns and were clothed in long white robes that reached to their feet. She described them not with awe, but with certainty. Whatever had happened in that grave, Jemima Wilkinson seemed to have crossed a threshold, and she didn't come back alone. She was said to have proclaimed, "Yes, I have passed through the gates of a better world, and I have seen the light." Oh, and then came her vivid and detailed testimony, which, considering the miracle before the eyes of the onlookers, was disturbingly persuasive. She spoke of heaven, not in metaphors or parables, but as if she had literally toured the streets of gold herself. She described it with clarity of memory, not imagination. She said the angels had given her a mission, a divine charge. She had not merely returned to life, she had returned transformed. And from that day forward, she was no longer Jemima Wilkinson. She had been chosen to become the second Redeemer. And her purpose, to begin the moral regeneration of the world. And her resurrection was only the beginning. In light of her miraculous resurrection and rebirth, she revealed that the divine powers who sent her back to the world of the living had done more than just restore her life. They had given her a new spirit. The soul that had once been Jemima Wilkinson, she said, was gone, laid to rest for good. Within her now was something heavenly, something appointed. And with this transformation came a decree. She was never again to be called Jemima Wilkinson. That name belonged to the past, to the woman who was initially laid to rest in that coffin. From this moment forward, she was to be known only as the Publick Universal Friend. This was not a title or even a name, really, but a mantle borne by someone no longer claiming to be of this world. The friend claimed to be the embodiment of righteousness, and her message was clear. She was no ordinary prophet. She was being sent back with a purpose, and the clock had started ticking. And what's interesting, maybe that was just how an old formal spelling of the word, but public is actually spelled L-I-C-K, Publick. But yeah, what a name, the Publick Universal Friend. Very interesting. Now, today we might try to explain such a claim away. We'd likely call it a near-death experience and chalk it up to a hallucination brought on by the fever of death, or maybe even label it as an elaborate hoax, or some desperate bid for attention or even for financial gain. But in 1776, in a time when religion shaped reality, and when angels and demons walked among humanity freely, a return from the dead was heralded as a divine event. Naturally, the local minister wanted answers. Who were these angels? What did heaven look like? What message had this friend brought back from beyond the veil? So, he asked if she'd speak publicly at the church. And the friend readily agreed, of course. After all, this was the mission: to be heard, to be seen, and to call the world to account. Now, as the story goes, when the friend, or the puff, as we'll call her, the puff, the P-U-F, took the pulpit, something about her shifted. She preached like one possessed, but not by something dark, but by something radiant and unshakably sure of herself. Those who came expecting to see the frail, sickly woman that Jemima once was, found instead a firebrand, delivering sermons with a force that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. And her presence was something to behold. Even for skeptics, there was no denying it. She was striking. And not just because of what she said, but of course, how she looked while saying it. As the Marquis de Barbé-Marbeau observed with a mix of awe and intrigue, quote, "This soul sent from heaven has chosen a rather beautiful body for its dwelling, and many living ladies would not be unwilling to inhabit that outer shell." Yes, the friend didn't just command attention with her words and presence, she was quite the looker as well. And it led some to wonder if this really was a message from heaven. Why did it look so much like a temptation? Soon, word of this miraculous gal spread like wildfire through the towns and back roads of southern Connecticut. People came from miles around, some to gawk, some to believe, and some just to satisfy their curiosity. Who wouldn't be drawn in by tales about the woman who died and rose again, calling herself the Publick Universal Friend? Men found her to be an eyeful, of course, that much was certain. Be it man or woman, though, no one left without getting an earful as well, because the friend came armed with revelation, sharing everything the angels had told her. They promised her that she would live for 1,000 years, that she would rise to become the spiritual leader of a new nation, the United States of America. Not yet born, but already watched from above. She was a prophet, a vessel for God's words, a mirror reflecting a heaven few had dared to imagine. Naturally, she was invited to pulpits across Rhode Island and Connecticut, carrying her message of moral rebirth, divine instruction, and a world being reshaped, and God's people being called to rise with it. And boy, did people listen. Because whether they loved her or feared her, almost everyone believed her. The friend spoke like someone who knew what waited for them beyond the grave, with an unflinching certainty. According to biographer Herbert Wisby, the Publick Universal Friend wasn't just another charismatic voice in the pulpit. Jemima Wilkinson, or whatever had taken her place, seemed to carry what Wisby called a messianic complex. A belief not only that she was chosen, but that she was essential to the world's moral rebirth. Almost like a Christ figure. According to Wisby, that complex gave her an iron-like self-confidence, so unshakable it became magnetic. Pair that with her genuine sincerity, and it made her a preacher that people couldn't look away from. You didn't have to agree with her to be pulled in. These sermons were nothing short of a command performance, with moments that felt like something was genuinely piercing the veil, being passed down from on high. Not to mention, as we know, she was apparently a knockout, which I'm sure helped. One day in East Greenwich, when the friend stood before a group of 35 listeners, she paused mid-sermon and declared, "One of you will not live to see another day." The words dropped like a ton of bricks, as you can imagine. She didn't say it with a fluid passion or theatrics, just a simple, chilling promise. One that would shockingly come true. Sure enough, that very night, just hours after the friend's chilling prophecy, a young boy, he was a black servant, had been seated in the audience, and he doubled over and died. And he was young, like literally the age of a boy. He was a boy. Naturally, some said it was coincidence. Others even suspected foul play, such as maybe poison. But to many, it didn't matter how it happened, only that the Publick Universal Friend had spoken it, and it had come to pass.
Well, it kind of matters how it happened.
Right,
It would be
yeah.
an insane coincidence, but if poison was the reason and it was her, then of course that would matter.
Right, and of course it has to happen to the poor servant. It couldn't
Right,
happen to
right.
some rich asshole,
Of course, yeah. He's a servant. He's just a child. I mean,
Right,
God.
exactly. That kind of immediacy, the way life and death seemed to follow in her wake, only deepened the legend surrounding her. And with that legend came loyalty. As she traveled from town to town, the friend began to gather followers who were zealous, devoted, and utterly convinced of her righteousness. They became known as the Jemimaites. And by 1780, the friend and her growing flock had settled in New Milford, Connecticut. There they built their own house of worship, a sacred space for her sermons, and the slow, certain shaping of a new spiritual order. The Publick Friend wasn't just preaching anymore, she was establishing a kingdom right there in New England. Stories and rumors swirled around the Publick Universal Friend like a mist. She was a walking Reddit thread, with tales of her acts becoming stranger and increasingly unbelievable. Most told of her gift of prophecy, of course, and her uncanny ability to foresee events with eerie precision. But more and more, the tales turned from visions to miracles. She wasn't just a mouthpiece for heaven anymore. She was beginning to be seen as a living vessel of divine power. More divine than disciple. And then came the moment that would either seal her sainthood or shatter her following. In Swansea, Massachusetts, the friend made a bold proclamation. As a demonstration of her divine authority, she would replicate the feat of the first Redeemer himself. This gal was gonna walk on water. The announcement was made with an unflinching sincerity. The word spread, and when the day arrived, they came by the thousands from all around. Crowds gathered along the shores of Mount Hope Bay, their eyes fixed on the water, waiting to see whether this woman could defy nature itself. They came seeking a sign, but what they got was something else entirely. The crowd fell into a hush as the friend emerged, radiant and regal as ever, and robed in flowing garments that shimmered in the sunlight like an angelic vision. She stood before the thousands gathered, her gaze sweeping over them with a kind of solemn weight. And then came the haranguing. She preached a fiery, relentless message, warning of sin, calling on everyone to repent. Her proclamations filled the salty air as the group listened with rapt attention. But everyone was really there for the big show that was still to come, the main event. Wrapping up her message, she turned, stepped toward the water, and with all the confidence of a chosen vessel of God, she stepped in. And then the girl sank like a stone. Just a splash of cloth and flesh meeting cold reality. And with it came gasps, laughter, and open expressions of doubt. The crowd, whether they expected her to actually walk on water or not, was shocked. Dripping and furious, Jemima turned on them all. Her failure, she declared, was their fault. The water hadn't held her because of their skepticism, their mockery, and their lack of faith radiating from the crowd. She stomped away, wet robes clinging to her like a heavy shame. The friend had come to walk on water, but instead gal went for a swim.
I mean, it sounds a little bit like an excuse. Like, come on, guys. You distracted me with your skepticism.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
You got in my head.
Come on. What are you guys doing over here? You know, at least a professional golfer gets the courtesy of some silence when they're making their first drive, you know what I mean?
Exactly.
While not certain, it's doubtful that the Publick Universal Friend ever actually attempted the walking on water routine again. After all, one very public sinking tends to make a second performance hard to sell. But like all good legends, the tale didn't die. It split, multiplied, and morphed, taking root in different corners of New England, each telling shaded with a slightly different truth. One alternative version ends not with soggy defeat, but with a masterstroke of spiritual theater. In this telling, the friend stood before the crowd, robes rippling, eyes alight, and posed the question not once, but over and over. Do you have faith?
Yes, we have faith.
Do you believe?
Yes, we believe.
Again and again she drove the ritual forward, working the masses into a frenzy, a feverish unity. She was doing crowd work, for God's sake.
Yeah.
Just as she stood poised to step onto the water, she paused. And one final time she asked, do you have faith? Do you believe I can do this thing?
Yes, we believe.
Well, she held that moment, a prophet standing on the edge of the impossible. And then she smiled and said, that is good. If you have faith, you need no evidence. And with that, she gathered her robes, turned from the bay, and walked away dry as a bone, triumphant as ever. It didn't matter whether or not she could perform the miracle. She already performed the crowd baby, played him like a fiddle. But, as I said, that's just one version of the story. I would be fucking pissed if that was the version I got.
Yeah, I mean, that would be like showing up to a WWE match and like,
Do you guys believe I can win this match? If you believe, I don't need to actually go through with it.
Right.
You're not gonna see The Rock and Undertaker tonight.
That's right. Or it'd be like a band coming out and be like, you guys ready to rock Detroit? Yeah. Well, that's good enough. Because you know we could play these songs if we wanted to and then leave.
right, just show up and be like, you remember this hit?
Yeah.
You remember this hit song?
Yeah.
I'm glad you guys enjoyed.
And then there's a version that the skeptics tell. In this version, the miracle was smoke and mirrors. The friend's loyal followers, wanting desperately to solidify Jemima's divinity in the eyes of the masses, were said to have built a wooden walkway that lay just beneath the water's surface at Mount Hope Bay. Invisible to the crowd, it would allow the friend to stride across the waves, appearing to defy the laws of nature, while quietly walking on faith and plywood. But legend says the non-believers, those who'd come not to worship but to watch her fail, got wind of the plan. And under the cloak of night, they removed a few critical planks from the platform. So when the day came, when the friend gathered her robes and stepped into the water with all the grandeur of a divine emissary, she took a few glorious dry steps and then suddenly sank. Not swallowed by divine mystery or unseen forces, but betrayed by the absence of 2x4s. And just like that, the miracle unraveled. Now, I would say, even if you got a few steps in, that's still impressive. It's kind of like Wile E. Coyote when he runs off a cliff, and it's not until he looks down that he falls.
Exactly. And that would make sense that it was more of a parlor trick planned. We don't know. Obviously, there's multiple tellings here, but that one makes a lot of sense that she had this plan and that somebody sabotaged it.
Right. Exactly. Because then, like I said, it leaves enough room for debate, because especially if the masses don't see that there's a walkway, they might go, well, she still did walk on water part of the way, like,
Right.
and then fell. So it kind of gives ammo for both sides. Ooh, just had to take a quick pause there, Creep Street, just to give your poor palpitating heart a rest. If you're enjoying this episode, go ahead and follow us on Facebook, Instagram at Creep Street Podcast, Twitter at Creep Street Pod, TikTok at Creep Street Podcast. That's right. And if once a week is not enough for you, just head on over to patreon.com for all sorts of goodies. We got 3 different tiers there, something for every tier. So get your fixins. We even got a free tier where you can listen to the weekly sketches before they go live on the episode. Now, without further ado, back to today's story. Just like that, though, the miracle unraveled. The illusion was shattered, leaving behind only wet robes and doubt. It wasn't just her body that took a plunge that day, it was her reputation and her claim to immortality. And just when you thought the stories couldn't get any stranger, there's another tale in which the Publick Universal Friend not only walked on water but aimed to outdo herself yet again. This time she would attempt to raise the dead. The event was announced and the date was set, like a pay-per-view.
Shit, it's buffering again.
Ha! Yes, buffering indeed. Buffering indeed. Because what was about to happen was batshit in 4K. The crowd gathered, buzzing with anticipation and unease, and the faint, terrible hope that they might see death defeated. The friend stood before them, solemn and radiant, and beside the shrouded corpse, she prepared to call the soul back from the beyond, and a skeptic, it said, stepped forward. The friend stood before them, solemn and radiant, and beside her was the shrouded corpse. She prepared to call his soul back from the beyond, when a skeptic stepped forward. He asked flatly if anyone could verify that the body was truly dead. And then louder so all could hear, he made an offer. "Let me run it through with a sword, then we'll know." And with that, the miracle happened. The corpse sprang to its feet and ran for its dang life. A very living, very terrified person was said to have bolted through the crowd.
It was like, I just got back, man. Don't run me through with a sword.
Right, exactly.
I'm getting a second chance here.
Now, whether this was a staged miracle or not, one thing's clear. The Publick Universal Friend may have claimed to hold the keys to life and death, but even she couldn't account for a corpse that knew when to run. Next, enter a man named Judge William Potter. He was a man of prominence, wealth, and no small amount of pride. His estate, called Old Abbey, was said to be the grandest in Kingston, Rhode Island. A stately home fit for a gentleman of the bench. But even privilege can't keep out death, as we know. His daughter, Susanna, had grown gravely ill. The local doctors had tried everything from leeches to tonics to prayers, but nothing seemed to be working. That's when the friend arrived. Radiant and confident, she promised the desperate Mr. Potter a cure. Desperate and weary, Judge Potter and his wife Penelope agreed. After all, what did they have to lose? But what came next was something they could have never predicted. Because the friend didn't come alone, she brought her flock, the faithful, fanatical followers now known as the Jemimicans. They changed their name from the Jemimaites to the Jemimicans.
Yeah, I guess it just had a better ring to it.
Probably just a little easier to say. Jemimicans! That sounds like something you'd shout if, like, when you're startled.
Yeah.
Jemimicans! And before the Potters could say no, well, gosh dang, this whole group of Jemimicans moved in with them. Suddenly, the halls of Old Abbey, once filled with the hush of polite society, were alive with constant chanting, rituals, and the drone of prophecy. The Friend had turned the mansion into a temple, and the Potters' lives into a sideshow, their home into a holy ground, and that's when, as the old stories say, all hell broke loose. Because despite all the incense and prayers and all the thundering promises of divine favor, Susanna Potter died. Judge Potter's little girl, his only daughter, slipped away under the same roof where the Puff and her followers had sworn she'd be saved. But Jemima wasn't rattled in the slightest. Oh, no, no, no. Instead, she simply pivoted. If she couldn't prevent death, well, she'd just have to reverse it. She told the grieving Potters that she would bring Susanna back. It might take some time, of course. A miracle of that magnitude required patience, but she had plenty. After all, she reminded them, she was going to live for 1,000 years, right? Well, the Potters weren't immortal. They were heartbroken parents, waiting for the Friend to make good on her godly boast while their daughter lay dead. Days passed, then weeks, and still no resurrection. And as one account puts it with devastating finality, quote, "The laws of nature were inflexible. And in the end, Susanna stayed dead. And the Friend's promise, like so many others, never rose from the grave." Now, by the time the Puff and her Jemimikins were finally shown the door at Old Abbey, she had done more than wear out her welcome. She had lightened Judge Potter's pockets by thousands of dollars. Oh, and that wasn't the end of her divine fundraising efforts. No, another miracle of generosity was just over the horizon. This time from the state of Rhode Island itself. While she and her followers were staying overnight at the home of the state treasurer, something curious occurred. Let's call it a mysterious transaction. A not-so-insignificant sum of money somehow made the holy leap from the state treasury directly into the coffers of the Publick Universal Friend. And apparently, the good Lord commanded a heavenly redistribution of wealth. To the faithful, it was further proof of her divine favor. To the skeptics, well, they called it theft with flair. Either way, Jemima never claimed to be bound by earthly bookkeeping. When you walk with angels, the rules of man don't always apply. Well, it wasn't long after that divine withdrawal that rumors were swirling that showed the tide was turning against the so-called prophetess. So the Puff made a decision. It was time to go out west. Faith in New England was waning, and the whispers of doubt were growing louder than the hymns. But there were plenty of lost souls still out there, and somewhere out west the next chapter awaited. So she did what any self-proclaimed Messiah would do. She summoned her Jemimikins, who prepared for her a well-padded easy chair, something fit not just for travel, but for something like a royal procession. Painted loud and proud, and a little absurd, it bore her holy initials, P.U.F., emblazoned on both sides like a seal of celestial royalty. She climbed aboard, and the Jemimikins lifted her high, carrying their prophetess like a living ark of the covenant. And off they went, marching westward towards the promised land of upstate New York. A land where the soil was fertile, not just for crops, but for doe-eyed believers. A place where prophets, seers, and spiritual revolutionaries seemed to sprout like weeds. And in that wilderness of believers and would-be saviors, the Puff would stake her final claim. But fortunately for the Friend, the Lord's ledger was flush, or at least her coffers were. Between the donations and the disappearances of state funds and the unwavering devotion of her followers, she made more than enough to finance her next divine endeavor. And so, with pockets full and a sense of purpose blazing within, She purchased land in the wide open wilds of upstate New York, where she founded what she called her, quote, Little Jerusalem. It was a settlement and a sanctuary, her own kingdom carved from the wilderness, where she could preach, prophesy, and reinvent herself one last time. There she presided for the rest of her days, no longer the scandalous firebrand of New England, but something softer and more tame. Time as a way of sanding off the edges, and in her later years, the Friend was remembered not for her failed miracles or flamboyant titles, but for something gentler. She became known as a sincere, kindly, and even benevolent woman, a preacher and shepherd to her flock, and a mystery to everyone else. She may have started as Jemima Wilkinson, a sickly, self-educated Quaker girl with no formal power or standing, but she became the first native-born woman in American history to found her own religious society. That alone places her in rare company, such as Universalist John Murray and Shaker visionary Mother Ann Lee. The Publick Universal Friend stands as one of the three great religious trailblazers of the Revolutionary era. She didn't come from money, and she wasn't simply handed a pulpit or platform, but somehow, through sheer conviction, charisma, and a dose of divine drama, she drew to her side a following that was, ironically, wealthier and better educated than she herself ever was. And not only did she preach, she led a whole flock, physically and spiritually, into the primeval American wilderness, a landscape as untamed as her theology. And there, in a clearing cut from the forest and faith, she built Little Jerusalem, a place meant for her faithful and where the ordinary rules bent. Somehow, this average young woman in colonial America was able to lead men and women alike towards something strange and to something sacred. At least to some. She may have walked away from her own name, past, and, according to some, the laws of nature, but more than anything, Jemima Wilkinson carved out a new identity. One bold enough to outlive her, and weird enough to be remembered to this day. As Herbert Wisby so aptly put it in his biography of the Friend, quote, Jemima Wilkinson deserves to be ranked with the small group of outstanding women of the colonial period. And he's right. She was more than a preacher, she was a disruptor. Even if it was all bullshit, you do have to hand it to her. She claimed authority where none were granted and built a movement when most women weren't even allowed a voice in the pulpit, let alone a kingdom of their own believers. She named herself anew, declared death beaten, and envisioned a life that would last 1,000 years. And sure, that part didn't quite pan out. In the end, Jemima, quote, left time, as her followers would later put it, in 1819 at the age of 67. Not quite eternal, but not bad for someone who had already died once before. So whether you believe she was truly touched by the divine or simply one of the boldest religious showmen in American history, one thing is certain. The Publick Universal Friend may be gone, but she still lives in legend. And legends, as we know here on Creep Street, have a funny way of never staying buried. Kind of like Jemima herself. And that will wrap it up for the Publick Universal Friend. Now, I called it the cult because in a way it was. Now, there wasn't, what we usually associate with cults, especially ones we cover here on Creep Street, as far as we know, the violence or anything like that. And I'm assuming people were able to come and go if they wanted to. Maybe the financial aspect, if people were giving their life savings over or something, that might be obviously a more cult-like. But yeah, like the sources said, regardless if it was all bullshit, for a woman in that time to claim the respect and authority she had was really impressive, even if it was all bullshit.
Absolutely. It's very unique in that way. And she seemed like a very ambitious person. Because, to me, I definitely lean toward she was a religious showman, but especially considering all the things that she predicted that didn't come to pass. But
Right.
that still doesn't make it any less impressive. Like you said, I mean, she clearly had ambition.
Yeah.
And was successful.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, honestly, probably if she was born today, she might have been like a movie star. She had charisma, she had looks, she was able to deliver, I guess, almost like a performance in a way, like was able to give a very earnest when she was preaching, as if, she seemed to actually believe it herself. She might have been a big movie star or something like that, if it was today.
Which also, I wonder, I'm sure she probably faked her death. If indeed all of this is bullshit, then that initial resurrection was probably staged somehow.
I thought about that too, and part of me wouldn't be surprised because back then they used to put bells on tombstones with
That's
strings that would go down to the coffin, because people were actually somewhat fairly often buried alive, because if you were in a state of, if you were in a coma or something like that, you might by all accounts appear dead. And because they don't have ways of monitoring the heartbeat, or, especially if it was very faint or whatnot, it was very often that this sort of thing happened. You heard of people like suddenly sitting up in their coffin and whatnot because they weren't actually dead. So you might be right. You might be right that it was all fake, or it might be a case of that where they truly thought she was dead and was basically on the fence of being dead, and then maybe came to.
Right, that's a good point. Very possible. And then if that had happened, she could have conceivably said to herself, I'm going to take advantage of this reputation. I'm going to use this as an opportunity.
Right, because she might have seen herself as coming back from the dead as well. That might have helped install that sense of conviction, because I'm sure, part of her, even if she knew she couldn't walk on water, part of her really had to believe that she was touched by God. I wouldn't be surprised if she believed it herself to some extent, if that was the case, if she was essentially on death's door and then made that recovery and believed herself to have been dead. So
yeah, she could have genuinely believed it. You're right. Imagine she was in some sort of a coma or something. She snaps out of it. She's probably convinced that, this was something divine.
Yeah. And, of course, we will never know for sure, but it sounds like at least she wasn't violent with her group, or there wasn't weird, as far as we know, weird sexual stuff or anything like that going on that you hear so often about in cults. But very fascinating. I mean, truly, in a weird way, your American story of someone coming from nothing and rising to the top.
Rags to riches.
That's right. Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, did she convince that state treasurer guy from Rhode Island to give her the money, or was there a little bit of hanky-panky going on? Yeah.
Right. How did she get that money? Who knows?
Yeah. Interesting indeed. But I'll tell you what, Gage, I got a list of names I wouldn't mind building the New Jerusalem with.
Oh yeah? Who's that?
The names of our top-tier Patreon subscribers. Of course, the Dream James Watkins, the Finnish Face via Lungfist, the Madman Marcus Hall, the Tenacious Teresa Hackworth, the Heartbreak Kid Chris Hackworth, the oh-so-suave Sean Richardson, the Notorious Nicholas Barker, the Terrifying Taylor Lashmet, the Count of Cool Cameron Corliss, the Archduke of Attitude Adam Archer, the Sinister Sam Kiker, the Nightmare of New Zealand Noeline Vivilli, the Loathsome Johnny Love, the Carnivorous Kevin Bogey, the Killer Stud Carl Staub, the Firestarter Heather Carter, the Conqueror Christopher Damian Damaris, the Awfully Awesome Annie, the Murderous Maggie Leach, the Serve Sexy Sam Hackworth, the Evil Elizabeth Riley, Lauren Hellfire Hernandez Lopez, the Maniacal Laura Maynard, the Vicious Karen Van Buren, the Arch Nemesis Aaron Bird, the Sadistic Sergio Castillo, the Rapscallion Ryan Crum, the Beast Benjamin Huang, the Devilish Chris Doucette, the Psycho Sam, the Electric Emily Zhang, the Ghoulish Gert Hankum, the Renegade Corey Ramos, the Crazed Carlos, the Antagonist Andrew Park, the Monstrous Michaela Schur, the Witchy Wonder J.P. Weimer, the Freaky Ben Forsyth, the Barbaric Andrew Barry, the Mysterious Marcella, the Hellacious Cale Hoffman, and Pugblorb, the Poltergeist. Yes, folks, that's right. If you want admittance into the promised land, just go to patreon.com/Creep Street Podcast for all sorts of goodies. We got 3 different tiers over there. Technically 4, because there's a free tier. Go there. There's something for everybody. Go check it out. We'd love for you to join the inner circle of family there. Folks, as always, follow us on all of our socials. Get in some of those listener stories. Feel free to email us or DM us on any of our socials. Our email is creepstreetpodcast@gmail.com. Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
And I'm Gage Hurley.
Good night and goodbye.